Hey everyone, welcome back. Brand new Take Aim podcast, and welcome to episode 249. This week I have Josh Dahlke with me from the Hunstand app. But Josh shares with us his hunt he just had out there in Western Nebraska, mule deer hunting, and we talk about all sorts of different tips, tactics, some of the methods they use to get on this mule deer. An awesome mule deer, by the way, that Josh killed. But everything from traditional scouting to being in the car, using a spotting scope, using the binos from, a vantage point to using the Hunstand app, wind direction, 3D mapping, all that good stuff, and how it all came together. So it's an awesome episode. Hope you guys really enjoy. Josh also shares with us, all the listeners, that we are getting a 10% discount off the Hunstand Pro, or upgrade to the Pro, I should say. Use the discount code TAKEAIM10. But it's a great show. Thanks, Josh, for being on. We'll see you guys again next week. All right, boys and girls, we are live, brand new Take Aim podcast, and excited to have this guy back with me from Hunstand, Josh Dahlke. What's happening, Josh?
I am sitting here in a hunting camp in northwestern Nebraska, just kind of clinging on my last few hours of being here and enjoying myself and just thinking back on a great hunt.
Yeah, man, I know we talked on your, basically you were driving out there, you were probably on 90 or 80-90 somewhere and headed west, and we were trying to make this work, and it was like, boom, the next day or two, I'd seen you shot a really awesome Western Nebraska muley, so congrats on that.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a lot of luck involved, but also quite a bit of planning and strategy, so it was the perfect combination, and at the end of the day, I just was fortunate to stumble into a great deer.
Yeah, man. Yeah, you did, definitely. So let's talk a little bit about that. I know that I kind of want to we talked offline for a minute about Hunstand and how do you kind of use that to set up some of your spots you're going to scout and potentially hunt. But I know that, like I said, it was literally like 48 hours, Josh, and you had killed a really nice deer. So, but I know before that you kind of had, some trials and tribulations. You bounced around a couple spots trying to get to that right area, but man, it's unbelievable that you kind of figured out some ground like that fast.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I should say is, the way I look at it with hunting in most places I go is a lot of times it's a team effort, whether it's just one friend or multiple friends or even just taking into account observations that you hear about from farmers or ranchers or neighbors or anything like that. So it's always difficult for me to take too much credit for any given hunt because there's a lot of things that go into it, even if you're just talking about land management or somebody planting a crop that you're hunting over or whatever it is. I think there's a lot of credit due to other folks in any given scenario. And this was one of those where I definitely like to give a shout out to my friend Travis Johnson. His family has a ranch out here in northwest Nebraska along the Pine Ridge that they've had for 20 years now. It's a working cattle ranch. I've hunted out here numerous times, developed a great friendship with them, and I decided I wanted to do an early archery hunt out here, and we kind of threw it together at the last minute, and Travis helped me get on his in-laws' place, and so we didn't have a whole lot of time to put the puzzle pieces together with the deer movements, but he glassed a couple times before I came, put out a couple cameras, and there were a few deer showing up, but essentially I got here and we were almost starting from scratch, and so we just got out there right away, started getting on the glass, spent the first 2 days or day and a half just strictly glassing and trying to get a lay of the land and making sure I wasn't going to go in somewhere and screw something up. So then by the time we decided to hunt, we had some pretty good confidence in where to go. So it's been a process, but it's also been a roller coaster because where I ended up shooting the deer was not at all where I anticipated.
Yeah, that's really cool that it worked out that way. And, you're right on, point with what you said there. You always want to, take advantage of whoever you're with. Like you said, a team effort, and it basically those types of hunt where you're going out of state and somewhere new, like as me and you would say, Josh, it's MRI. It's most recent information, man. So if you have to, man, you soak all that in as much as you can to get that. And then it starts to become a little more familiar, the habitat and the places that he's talking about, your friend's talking about, and it doesn't seem so foreign, you know what I mean? But that's it's just such an important point to reiterate, is take advantage of those things of, friends and locals like that are giving you access.
Yeah, and the way I look at it is you always end up returning the favor in one way or another, whether it be that same person or somebody else. That's why I love hunting so much in the hunting community. Just surround yourself with people who everybody wants everybody else to be successful, and if you're not surrounding yourself with those types of people, then you're probably not hanging around the right folks. But I've been lucky to meet a lot of great people across the country, and it's the type of thing where you could show up on a random day and have somewhere to stay, and vice versa. If someone rolls into my neighborhood and they need somewhere to crash or they need some help with something, it's pretty powerful friendships you can build through this thing we like to do called hunting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's very true, and that's what it's really all about. So that's very cool, and it's nice to have friends like that, and it's neat that for a lot of us, hunting has brought that to us. So. But getting back to your start of your hunt, Josh, when you guys were out and you guys were glassing and doing all that good stuff and the pre-scouting, had you kind of made up your mind, or were you going to just kind of let the cards fall where they were, if you were going to, you guys start with mule deer or whitetail, because that area had some really good deer for both?
Well, I grew up hunting whitetails. I still continue to hunt whitetails a lot, but whenever I have a chance to try to go after a mule deer, I get really excited just because I don't have as many of those chances, and to me, they're just the iconic Western animal, and I think out of all the deer species in the world, I'd argue that they're the coolest, most beautiful. You see a big muley, and it's just they always look really impressive, and generally the big ones are a little bit bigger bodied than your average whitetail, if they're in the same area, and then of course their antlers are a spectacle when you get a mature mule deer. It's really a showstopper. So I was hoping to come across a muley, but it was one of those situations with both species where if the right deer showed up wherever we were set up, I was going to be more than happy with a whitetail or a muley. But as luck would have it, the cards just kind of fell in the direction of stumbling into a mule deer. And so when we first started scouting and everything, we were seeing both. And this time of year, it's actually been unseasonably hot. When I first got here, it was in the 80s, and then it actually peaked at 104 on Saturday.
Holy hot.
So it was burning hot. Like literally on Saturdays, you get out of the truck and it feels like someone's holding a flame up against you. It got so hot. But here's the interesting thing, and it's something that I've never personally seen anywhere I've hunted with either deer species, but these deer have been moving like, I don't want to say all day, but they've been coming out at 2, 3 p.m. in the afternoon and starting to work out in the fields and feed and whatnot. So I don't know if they're so desperate for moisture that they're coming out to feed earlier to pull moisture out of some of the food sources, or what the deal is, but the amount of deer movement I've seen in the 80s to 100-degree temperatures, I've never seen anywhere else. I don't know if you've experienced that, but it's pretty wild.
That is really wild. That's really weird, and I would pretty much say that I contribute the same thing. What you're saying, like it has to be about moisture. A few years back I was in Alberta, and it wasn't quite that hot. Like some days we had days that, it peaked at 90. And we hunted all day, even in those temps, but every deer we did see after, I'm not going to lie, at 10:30 in the morning, most of those deer were bedded. So, man, I can't really say I've experienced that, but it makes a lot of sense what you're saying.
Yeah, so originally the plan was to focus on water, and out here there are a couple pasture ponds, but most of those are dried up right now, so you're really looking at water tanks, cattle water tanks, and that was the initial thought going into this, that we'd have to focus on those because it'd be the best common denominator for the heat and the deer right now. But quickly realized that the deer were moving, and they were moving all over the place, and they were going to food sources, and so they weren't just concentrated on the water. So that kind of, it was a double-edged sword. It made things good because it was promising to know that deer are moving during daylight hours, but also it widened the field in terms of figuring out exactly where to sit. And I guess the way that we worked that out was we had a couple different setups around water tanks, and a couple different setups that were just more so travel corridors, your typical bed to food type situation. And ultimately, I sat a water tank, I believe it was Friday evening, and had a lot of deer activity, but the cattle were still in that pasture, and they were blocking the deer from the water tank. So all evening we had deer coming up trying to get to that tank, and the cattle wouldn't let them through. So then they would just go back out and feed in a chopped cornfield, which was very frustrating. But it is what it is. That's what happens when you hunt on a cattle ranch sometimes. I mean, the cows are going to be whatever pasture they're in is where they're at, and it's not like somebody's going to go change pastures just because you're out there to deer hunt. You just got to work with it. So we were really hoping something would show up and those cows would move out, and almost all the cows moved out. It started with 50 by the water tank, and then by the end of the evening there was only 10, and I was hoping those were going to skedaddle. But they didn't, and one of the cows actually climbed up in the tank, and it was standing in there for the last hour and a half of that evening hunt, which was comical, but it was also kind of infuriating because sure enough, at last light, in the last 10 minutes of shooting light, I looked over right when we were about to hang it up, and there was a big tall mule deer just off to the side in the tall grass trying to get to that water tank. And he didn't stick around too long. He stood there, he realized the cows weren't going to budge, and then he just vanished. And so it was cool to have a close encounter, but always frustrating when you know that one little small detail could have made the difference between getting a shot and not, and those cows were that detail.
Yeah, I mean, that is so crazy. You know, it's literally they're the epitome of bullheaded. You know, like cows are like that, and it, like you said, what do? You know, because they don't really give a crap. They don't give a crap about nothing. They seem not to care about. You know, they don't get spooked generally by human presence. So, you know, what do? You can run after them, and you're lucky if they even move. You know, they just don't care. It's hilarious. So, but nonetheless, very frustrating, like you said, and especially at last light like that, and potentially, you know, seeing a shooter buck.
Yeah, I mean, they did not like that we were there, and they made quite a ruckus when we went and set up the blind that afternoon. They were, all 50 of them were staring at the blind for the first 2 hours and mooing, and they were just pissed. And there were a couple, I guess they'd be heifers that were just really unhappy that we were there because they still had calves around and whatnot. So they were just, they were pissed, and they were letting us know it. And then eventually they finally got distracted and sort of forgot that we were there. But yeah, that was an experience. But I guess kind of rewinding a little bit, the hunt started with lots of glassing. Lots of just low impact stuff from a distance because it's sparse country out here. There's not a lot of cover. There aren't a ton of areas for bedding. And it feels like every time you go to make a move out here, even if you're just glassing from a distance or whatever it might be, it always feels like there's a deer watching you because they are. I mean, you try to get around on any property out here, very few trees, not even all that much tall grass or great places for them to bed. So you just know where there are places for them to bed. They're in there. And so it's a lot different than hunting where I grew up, where it's big timber and they've got way too many places to bed. So that's a whole different complication. But out here, it's like it's so sparse that you just got to be careful about every move you make because you don't want to bump those deer over to the next drainage or whatever it might be. So we started methodically mapping out all the different key parts of the property on Huntstand right when I got here. So I marked all the water tanks. I marked the draws that appeared to be funnels. I marked the neighboring agricultural fields. Just trying to put the big picture together to really just drill down and analyze with the mapping in combination with what we were seeing through the glass and the couple of trail camera photos we had to put it all together. And one of the things that was especially beneficial to me, being that it was the first time I'd ever seen this property and I was going to be jumping in to hunt it within, 36 hours, was to be able to not only map out those spots and drop pins, but I used our trace tool to determine how to get in the dark, because Travis kind of gave me a lay of the land, but then he had stuff to do the next day when I was actually going to get out there in the morning and hunt. So it's a foreign place. There's only so many gates. You're driving across these big cattle pastures. Everything looks different in the dark. So it was great because I used that trace tool. I traced a path exactly where we had taken the Yamaha side-by-side through the pasture. And so I wasn't out there in the morning fumbling around trying to figure out where I'm going. And it's just those little details like that that reduce your stress level and just make you more efficient with your time and just give you the confidence that you need so that when you can go into a place to strike, you feel good about it.
Yeah, that's such a cool feature. And that feature, to me, gives you so much confidence because, one, like you said, you're walking ground you never walked before. Then you add in, you do that in the dark with your gear. And the last thing, as you know here, Josh, like you do that in Michigan or Minnesota or Missouri, Illinois, next thing you know, you're like in a briar patch somewhere and you can't get out, so it's nice to have that clean access route. Like you said, it's just so efficient and it's less intrusive, and, you're to that spot and, like it's game on, so to speak. But that's such a great feature, man. That's, like I said, it's just nice to have that, and I've used it. It literally, you can follow it to a T right to where you're going. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I was driving the side-by-side in the morning, and I had it in my hand, and I was just following the path because where we are at, a lot of ranches have two tracks that are used to get everywhere, but this place was a little bit different. Like, we were just driving across random chunks of pasture, and it's so rugged out here with just the pasture ground itself is super bumpy, and there's a lot of holes, and there's actually a lot of like little miniature canyons and stuff that if you don't know where you're going, not only could you get yourself in an accident, but you could kill a lot of time by taking the wrong way to get in somewhere. I mean, there is no going as the crow flies. Like, you have to navigate around all sorts of weird terrain. And then, there's only so many gates to get through fences. And so if you don't know where all that stuff is, next thing you know, you're driving around and shooting lights started and your hands are in the air. So that was very helpful. And it was definitely a key part of the strategy.
Now, when you were mapping out some of the rest of it, Josh, one of the neat features, let me rewind this a little bit, like the fact that you mentioned this earlier in the podcast and I didn't get to jump on it, but just us being Midwest guys and always hunting whitetail, like it's such a cool experience to go out there and do that mule deer type of stuff like that. But I feel like because of the background we have in whitetail hunting, we adapt to that mule deer side so well. And with that being said, tell me a little bit, what did you look for using, Hunstand to like kind of locate some of those bedding areas? Because like you mentioned in the podcast, you say it's really sparse. So what were some of those just little details that you're like, they potentially are bedding here or coming and going, this is a travel route?
Well, out here, cover could be anything from one patch of grass or brush that is a little bit better and protected than just grazed off pasture, or it could be a little canyon. Out here, there are some big canyons, and there are some big valleys and rolling hills and whatnot, but there's also all these tiny little microchasms that the mule deer use because they can hide in them, they can feel safe in them, they can get shade. And, a lot of people have probably heard this before about mule deer, but oftentimes what they'll do is they will bed in a manner that the wind is coming from their back so they can smell what's behind them and they can see what's ahead of them. And I mean, whitetails do the same thing, but mule deer do that out here in this big open country. So really just looking for any kind of subtle change in the terrain or, of course, timber. I mean, anytime there's a patch of timber, you really, really you just have to assume there are deer in there. And because the patches are often, yes, I mean, and the tough part is you have to stay away from it because a lot of the patches of timber out here are so small that like it's not even an option to go set up on the edge of it, because if you do, the deer are going to see you. I mean, so many of these patches, if you stand on one side, you can see through all the way to the other side. So if you keep your distance, and especially if you're driving in a vehicle or something, they're used to the ranchers out here doing that. They're not going to think twice. But if they know that you get a little bit too close, I mean, if you think about the patterns of a cattle rancher, it's not often that they're going to have to drive a vehicle or walk too close to a patch of timber, because what are they doing out here? They're moving cattle. They're maybe throwing out salt blocks. They're checking fences, all that kind of stuff. They don't do their work close to the timber most of the time. So I believe that these deer, they have their buffer zone just like deer do anywhere. Even if you're talking about like backyard suburban deer, they know that if someone is walking 10 feet outside the edge of the woods on a trail with their dog, that's normal. But as soon as that person steps foot one step into the woods, that's in their buffer zone, and they're not okay with it anymore. So it's the same out here. They know what that safe radius is, and so you don't want to penetrate that. So what makes it difficult is you know a lot of times you can't just go set up a tree stand on an edge of one of those patches or a ground blind, because they're going to hear you or they're going to see you or they're going to smell you. So you need to try to figure out where they're going from there. And, you know, it's your obvious stuff, food sources and water sources. I mean, those are the things that you really have to try to focus on. But also the subtleties in the landscape that they use to get from point A to point B. A great example is the first evening we were glassing. We saw a bunch of mule deer come out of this small patch of timber, and they were going to an alfalfa field that was actually it's a lot of drought out here right now, so that the field was dang near useless, but they were still finding some food in it. And when they came out of that timber, there was just this tiny little spine that came out of the timber that was almost, you would almost overlook it, but they use that coming out every evening because they're able to see all around them versus just riding on one side of it. They come out on that spine. So as soon as they come out, the entire time they go to that field, they can see everything around them. So if there's a threat, they're going to be able to just bounce right back into that timber. On the flip side, sometimes they'll get real sneaky and they'll use dips in the landscape. Like if they want to cross a big open area, they won't go across a big flat. They'll find just a really subtle, I don't even know if you'd want to call it a draw, but just like any kind of lower elevation spot that they can hide a little bit better as they're going from point A to point B. So as you start to look at the maps, and like if you use the 3D view in Huntstand, you can recognize these things, and you look at where they might be coming from, you look at where they might be going, and if you have to choose one spot to set up along, it's going to be one of those little subtle changes in the terrain. That would be your best bet versus just trying to set up, out in the middle of nowhere on a flat. And also to that end, depending on the seasonality of it, maybe you could go set up at their destination, but early season, they might not make it there before shooting light is still available. So you got to make that decision, and that's where the glassing comes into play as well. Are they getting there with enough shooting light? And if they're not, well, then you need to figure out how to get between them and where they're bedding, because you can't set up on the food source or the water, and you can't set up in their bedroom. So you got to try to just find somewhere to get in between.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's well put for sure. Would you say, Josh, that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like finding some of those features, unless you're using like the 3D mapping, you almost have to walk it all, right? Because you can't really see some of those features just sitting in the truck like glassing, because they're basically just, you're seeing it from one point of view, right? Not seeing all of it. So that had to be a huge help. Yeah. Okay.
Even when you're glassing from a distance in a place like this, great example would be the first morning that I spent some time glassing. I was watching these deer come out to this cut cornfield. And unbeknownst to me, I didn't realize until later, but when we drove over to that cornfield in the middle of the day when all the deer had gone back to bed, there was like a massive gully in between where I had been glassing and where that cornfield was, and I had no idea it was there. It looked like the flat just went out and met the cornfield, but in between that flat and the cornfield, there was like a 15, 20-foot deep gully right there. So that's one of those things where I could have just looked on Huntstand, and if I would have just surfed around with a 3D view, I would have been able to see that. We wouldn't have even had to drive over there to look at it. But, I mean, those things can make or break. You look at something from a distance and you're thinking about setting up. It's heartbreaking when you go in there sometimes, especially in the dark, and you're like, oh, that looks like the perfect spot, and it's not anything like you thought it was going to be. And that's happened to me so many different times where you don't do your homework, and then you get there and you're like, oh, this is not what it looked like from 300 yards.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not a good feeling usually, for sure. But so you ended up kind of going through that whole mess, and then you ended up finding a spot that you really liked and ended up kind of leading to the hunt that evening. You killed your deer, but lead us into that, Josh, like what you used to figure out that spot you ultimately put up that ground blind.
So the original property that we were hunting on, I was starting to get that place figured out. The problem was we just weren't seeing any mature deer really on camera or through the glass. There was one whitetail that we spotted going to a water tank the first evening or the first morning that we were glassing. But it's just we didn't really see anything super promising. So we knew they were there, but we were still trying to hone in on them. And so when I sat the water tank that first evening, and that shooter mule deer rolled up, and the cows wouldn't let him in to drink, that was going to be my go-to spot. That was going to be my go-to deer, and I was going to figure out a way to connect with him because I knew exactly what chunk of woods he was bedding in, and there's only a few ways that he would come out that would make any sense. So I was going to focus my efforts on him, but then as luck would have it, Travis's brother-in-law had been glassing and was on a completely different property, and he saw some mule deer, a bachelor group that were going off of a irrigation pivot, and they were traveling about a half mile across this vast nothingness and with a canyon in between, and they were going to a windbreak that was out in the middle of basically just out in the middle of the prairie, out in the middle of the grassland. And a lot of deer hunters, especially Midwestern, like, you look at something like that, and even for me to this day, I mean, I've done a lot of Western hunting, but it's just mind-boggling to me what these deer have to rely on for their cover. And so here you are out in this, 400-acre field, and there's just one long row of cedar trees that's only about 10, 15 feet wide. And that's where they were going to bed. So Tyler, that's Travis's brother-in-law, had seen those deer doing that and kind of gave us the word. And so we just made a decision to abandon Plan A and hope that those deer did the same thing the next morning coming off that pivot and go back to that tree row. Well, we get out there in the morning in the dark, and it felt pretty hopeless. I mean, you walk out into the middle of this vast expanse, and there's a canyon, and there's like 12 different draws coming up the canyon, any of which they could use as they're coming across from that irrigation pivot. So basically they come off the pivot, they walk a flat, they drop down into this canyon. They can go left or they can go right, and then they can continue, or they can choose which little tiny draw they want to come up to get up onto the other flat and then get to those trees on the windbreak. So it's just kind of a roll of the dice. Well, somebody was looking out for us because I popped up the blind at the head of one of these little draws coming out of the canyon, and it just felt like you're in no man's land. Like, how are you ever going to have a deer walk by an archery range? And sure enough, at first light, I saw those bucks coming from that pivot area, and they just came in on a string. For whatever reason, it just, luck was in my direction that morning, and they walked right up that little canyon by us, and I ended up shooting one of the 3 bucks at 27 yards, and he only went about 50 before he dropped.
That's crazy. You know what's crazy, Josh, is just the way you explain this. This could be like yada yada. I spent the next 3 or 4 days switching every other draw in that canyon, and they always were at the next one. You know, like that could have worked out exactly like that. That's wild.
That's exactly what was in my head. I felt so hopeless popping up that blind that morning. It's just, I mean, they're either going to be within your shooting radius or they're not, and it's just a roll of the dice. But I will say one of the things that influenced where I set up was I did check Hunstand in the Hunt Zone wind map while we were out there. Actually, while we were standing there, before I figured out where to pop up that blind in the dark. And the only really recognizable feature on that tree row was, well, the end of it. You know, I figured if there's anywhere to choose, you're better off just setting up on the end of the tree row, because it's like, otherwise it's just a long tree row that's hundreds of yards long, and you're just choosing a random spot to put the blind. So I figured set up on the end, just in case for some reason maybe they go around the end of it versus just like cutting through an arbitrary spot. And so when I did that, I checked the wind to make sure that if they did cut that corner, that my wind would be in my favor. So I had just the perfect wind that was essentially blowing at an angle. So if they were to cut that corner, they weren't going to catch my wind. And so it's just another one of those subtle differences. I mean, if we would have been 50 yards further than we were along that canyon, they would have come up that canyon and got wind of us immediately. So it's just, a lot of it was luck, but it's just taking all the different things that you can and trying to make the best decision on the fly. Yeah,
that's really good forward thinking, because, you know, you and I know, Josh, like, I mean, maybe somebody's not thinking this way, but let's say you didn't shoot that deer that night, but that wind was still in your favor. I mean, that allows you to sneak back in there the next several days, hopefully, if that wind stays the same, that you can go in there and not put pressure on those mule deer and keep giving yourself another chance at shooting one. And I mean, that's just huge.
That's a great point. Because if you have animals patterned at all, I mean, that pattern means, you know, you got them at its basic level, you got them going from one point to another. Now, that might be 10 yards wide on a corridor that they're using, or it could be 300 yards wide. But either way, at least you kind of got them in a line, so you can figure out you got to set up somewhere along that line and then just sort of whittle it down as you go. But as soon as they get an idea that you're there, they might change that altogether, and then whatever little bit of a pattern you had figured out that you spent all that time and energy on, it might go down the drain. And time is the biggest factor. I mean, nobody has enough time where they can just hunt and hunt and hunt until they kill. It's like, unless you live somewhere or it's a property that you're going to all the time, if you're on a traveling hunt, you know that you have a certain time window to make it happen. And so while it would be nice to just sit here for weeks and try to get connected with a deer, it's just usually doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't. You know what's so neat about it is like this whole story, and in which, by the way, I didn't even, I kind of skipped over the cool part of you shooting that deer, Josh. So congrats on that. That's amazing, and an awesome buck that, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, he's got a really cool kicker off the back fork, which is pretty unique. Looks like it almost drops, or was that just his velvet kind of hanging there?
Yeah, he does actually have a kicker, and it looks like it kind of got broken off. But another unique thing that, it's funny, I didn't even realize it until I had the whole, the head all caped out and everything. I just, for some reason, overlooked it. But if you look at that deer, he's got opposite, so he's a 3x3, but he's got opposite forks. So on his left, he's got front forks, and on his right, he's got back fork.
That's wild. Yeah, he does. Yeah, that's super wild. Yeah, that's really unique. That's crazy unique. But
yeah, I mean, I can't think of a mule deer I've seen like that. I'm sure there's plenty of them out there, but I can't recall ever seeing one, so it's pretty neat.
Yeah, that is. That's really cool. But what I was going to say along with that, Josh, is just how cool it was that this whole story you shared, basically like the fundamentals of what you should be doing while you're hunting, and then merging basically what a lot of guys are doing now, using that new technology, like the Hunstand app, to basically just, put yourself in better positions to be a little bit cleaner in some of the steps you take, and all that just fundamentally, leads to a higher success rate. And it's just adding in the new with the old school, and man, it sounds like on this hunt you did it perfectly.
Yeah, I'm very thankful it worked out the way it did, and it is true, it's better to be lucky than good, but to defer to another cliche phrase, I do think that, how do they put it? Luck is what happens when preparation meets success, or something like that. Yeah,
or hard work, or one of the two, but that's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's so true, though, So I know you're still out there, actually, and you're getting ready to go hunt this evening, which is really cool as well.
Yeah, so back to the, just hunting with friends in this community that we have. Travis typically doesn't do any archery hunting. He's more so just a rifle hunter. He's working on the ranch and doing various jobs throughout the year. So he's only got so much time to hunt, and usually he spends that during rifle season. But I'm out here with a crossbow, and man, that's the cool part about crossbows. You can get somebody out literally immediately to hunt with an archery tool, and they don't need to spend weeks practicing and getting dialed so that they can take an ethical shot. I mean, it's a great gap. It's a great bridger between archery and gun hunting, is that crossbow. So while we were out there, just actually out getting some photography and video after my hunt, we saw a really, really big 2x2 mature mule deer coming out one evening, and I believe it's probably the same one I had coming to that water tank that first evening. And so we got pretty excited about that, and I think Travis is interested in picking up my crossbow and maybe trying to shoot that deer while I'm still here. I don't have a lot of time left, but I'm hoping I can twist his arm to get out this afternoon. And also, I really would like to get out there just because we've had an interesting thing happen here in northwestern Nebraska, and I know that a lot of the country has seen this weather system, but it dropped 60 degrees over the last 48 hours. It went from 90s to 30s, and so I'm looking out the window right now, and I was walking around in a t-shirt, shorts, and sandals 2 days ago and sweating and didn't even want to be out during the middle of the day, and I'm looking out there now, and we've got steady snow coming down.
Wow, that's so nuts, isn't it?
It's bizarre, and I can't help myself. I want to know what that's going to do to these deer. I would have to think if they were coming out early when it was 90 degrees, a lot of the mature bucks were still coming out after dark, but I think with the 60-degree shift in temperature, we might be able to see some more deer coming out that were hiding from us the last week.
Yeah, I would really think you guys would. I mean, I'm kind of curious. I want to talk to you maybe tomorrow and find out what you guys seen, because, man, you don't get too many major cold fronts in a hunting season, and like you're obviously on the verge of one. So hopefully tonight you guys get out there and slam a big one. But I mean, definitely take advantage of it. Sounds like you guys are gonna, but that's super cool.
Yeah, after I get off the phone here with you and finish up the podcast, I'm gonna give Travis a call. I've been poking at him for the last couple days, trying to get him motivated to get out there and go after that deer. I know he wants to. He's just such a busy guy that he's going to have to take some valuable time out of his day, but he seems pretty jazzed up about it, and I want to get him out here, take a few shots with the crossbow, make sure he's feeling good about that, and then just go pop up a blind in one of those spots that we've already sort of got figured out, and maybe that big 2x2 will show up. Yeah,
absolutely. And like you said, man, that is the perfect thing about the crossbow, is about bridging the gap, and hopefully Travis kills an awesome deer tonight, and I'd be curious to hear the story on that as well, you know. And hopefully, Josh, me and you can get back together here shortly. I know you're going to be on, you know, several other hunts, but whitetail season's right here, and I kind of would love to do another one here in October, November, and talk about, you know, basically the same strategies and how to implement Hunstand for some of the whitetail hunters in the hardwoods, and hopefully me and you shortly here both kill a nice one. But glad to see you're already on the board with awesome mule deer. I'm pretty jealous.
I appreciate it, man, and I really enjoy talking to you every time, and hopefully the listeners enjoyed hearing this story and learning about some of the strategy and things like that. We'll have to definitely keep up with each other throughout the season. I know you've got some big things coming up, and you've got some promising deer on camera, and I know you're going to connect with at least one of them. So when you do, I'd love to see some pictures right away. If you could send me a text or something.
Oh yeah, I will be for sure, man. You'll be right up there on that list, and you're one of a few select guys that have seen these pictures. I'll put it that way. So you'll definitely be getting the text for sure, man. But Josh, let everybody know where they can find you on Instagram, and where to follow along, you know, your adventures on Huntstand as well.
Yeah, so you can find Huntstand on Instagram with just @Huntstand, and then if you want to see some of the things I've been up to, it would be @TheHungerOfficial. The hunger, like having an appetite, official. And for your listeners, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to get everybody set up with 10% off a Hunstand Pro subscription. And if they want to take advantage of that, you can use code TAKEAIM10, that's TAKEAIM10, if you go to Huntstand.com and sign up for a Hunstand Pro subscription. That'll give you 10% off your first year.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, thank you guys for doing that. And make sure everybody take advantage of that for sure, because, I mean, the Hunstand Pro has so many more options to it. It's well worth a little bit of money. And, you know, speaking compared to some of the other hunting apps on the market, it's a fraction of the price, so you cannot go wrong. But, Josh, man, I'm super excited. That was a great story, and congrats again, and can't wait to do this again, man. Thanks so much.
All right, buddy. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, thanks.